So welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Moffitt. I'm the director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy. Glad to have you all here today as we try and make some sense of the events of yesterday. And I'm pleased to have three experts from the Political Science Department to help us understand what happened and where we go from here. Joining me are Professor Juliet, Professor Erik Patashnik, and Professor Wendy Schiller, who is also the chair of the Political Science Department here at Brown. So our time together will unfold in the following way. Each of our panelists will offer about 5 to 10 minutes of analysis on yesterday's elections. And then we'll engage in conversation for about another 20 minutes or so, and then we will open up the floor to your questions. We very much look forward to your questions. But let's dig right into the analysis. So starting us off will be Professor Juliet.
Thanks, Susan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the rhetoric in the campaign.
Speak louder.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me now? Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the rhetoric in the campaign and what I think we can take away from that, and also about some implications of the results in terms of thinking about the long-term health of U.S. democracy. So one of my main takeaways from last night, albeit not one that I am in any way happy about, is that racist rhetoric won. In particular, it won in the South, and in a number of places, while there were gains and there was good news that came from the night, there was no wholesale repudiation of the migrant caravan scare tactics and other racist appeals. This, despite the fact of the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh and the racist murder of two black senior citizens in Louisville, Kentucky, and other racist hate crimes inspired by the violent rhetoric. And so I think one of the debates that followed the 2016 election was this question of what had fueled support for Trump, and there was this analysis that much of it had to do with economic anxiety by white working class voters. And I think given that the end of the campaign was dominated not by economic, not by rhetoric on the campaign trail about the economy, nor about economic anxiety per se, but racialized anxieties having to do with, the migrant caravan, securing the border, anti-immigrant, xenophobic appeals, I think it's pretty clear that, in fact, what is driving much of the support for the GOP at this time, and what has become an important part of, the overt campaign strategy in U.S. elections now, are outright racist appeals. And I think that is obviously a cause for much concern. And I want to say something about how I think this is playing out in different places. I think what you see, if you look at the races in Georgia, the governor's race in Georgia, for example, and as well, which is still too close to call, as well as the Senate race in Texas, where Beto O'Rourke lost by 3 points. You still see that African Americans in particular are turning out and supporting Democratic candidates in the high 80s to 90%. But for Abrams, for example, only 24% of white men and white women supported Abrams. In Texas, only 28% of white men and 31% of white women supported Beto. So the issue here, I think, is, there was Latino support, it was about 60% for Beto. But the issue here, I think, is one of thinking about why is it that these racist appeals are resonating in many places in the United States, and why is it that people continue to support candidates even when they embrace those appeals. And I think the other issue that I would point to is that, you know, the candidates who won on the Republican side were not candidates who repudiated those appeals. They were ones who embraced them, right? So, so that is I think, a real question mark about, you know, the argument that it was economic anxiety that fueled the rise of, or the victory of Trump, and that is what is fueling support for the Republican Party. So one of my concerns going forward is thinking about, if there was no repudiation of racism, what that means given recent violent attacks that were spurred by, and hate crimes that have been spurred by this rhetoric. The other point that I want to make is that I think that we also need to think about the health of U.S. democracy. You know, that question has been posed before the election in terms of the, you know, the sort of breaking of norms and whether U.S. institutions could be resilient in the face of those norm violations. But I think that one of the things that is most concerning and that came to the fore in this midterm election is the question of voter suppression and gerrymandering and how that is shaping U.S. democracy, right? So we see that it took, you know, as of now, I think it's estimated at a 9% popular vote margin for Democrats to retake the House because of gerrymandering. And there were numerous, you know, especially in the Georgia race, examples of voter suppression. There was also issues in Florida, in Texas, in New York. So there's a real issue here with, you know, the way in which the U.S. runs its elections and what this means for, you know, and the discouragement of voting in order to maximize partisan gain, which has been really problematic for, the health of and the legitimacy of U.S. democracy, right? Because it means, right, that the incentives and the you know, seem to be towards not expanding the electorate, but rather trying to shrink it in order to retain, for the GOP in particular, retain its electoral position. I will say that there were some victories on that front last night, and those were, for example, automatic voter registration passed in Michigan. There was felon re-enfranchisement in Florida, and redistricting reform in Michigan, in Colorado, and Missouri. So there are initiatives at the local and the state level that people are trying to make to, I think, really address the question of attempts to impose minoritarian rule. And I think that is a long-term issue for the health of U.S. democracy that was highlighted by the election.
Thank you. And then next we'll have Professor Erik Patashnik.
Great. So I'll do some nuts and bolts about the federal elections. First, an overview. The election last night was to a large degree a referendum on President Donald Trump, and the results showed that the country remains deeply divided along geographic, demographic, and educational lines. Democrats won the cities and large swaths of the suburbs, which is a strong base of support in a country that is growing more diverse, but Republicans maintained their hold on predominantly white rural areas. It was a relatively high turnout election with enthusiasm on both sides. Overall, it was a good night for Democrats, but the massive blue wave that some progressives hoped for didn't materialize. Election forecasting was also a big winner. The results were broadly in line with expectations. And we also have a return to divided government, which is pretty much the norm in America. The average length of Republican unified party control, and since the post-war era, is just 3 years. Democratic unified control is just average 4 years. So time and time again, the American electorate seems to be signaling that they dislike single-party rule. So I'll talk about the House, Senate, and then some implications. The Democrats captured the House for the first time since 2010 by a solid margin. As of early this morning, Democrats had captured 29 Republican-held seats. Republicans had flipped 1 Democratic-held seat for a net Democratic gain of 28. There were notable Democratic wins in Virginia, Pennsylvania, Texas, and other states. Democrats did well in the House for three key reasons. First, President Trump is deeply unpopular. With an approval rating most recently around 42%, it was lower earlier in the year, despite presiding over a very favorable economy. Given the economic conditions, low unemployment, we would expect presidential approval to be much higher. So he has paid a price in that sense. President Trump's divisive rhetoric and his polarizing style was a massive liability in battleground suburban districts that GOP candidates could not overcome. Second, opposition parties historically do well in midterms, so it's no surprise that the Democrats picked up a seat. And also, Democrats ran strong, well-funded candidates, including a large number of women. In the Senate, the Democrats faced from the start a very tough map. They had to defend 26 seats, 10 of them in states won by Donald Trump in 2016, where Republicans only had to defend 9. Democrats lost incumbent races in Missouri, Claire McCaskill, Indiana, Joe Donnelly, and North Dakota, Heidi Heitkamp. And they could yet lose in Florida. 4 Senate incumbent defeats for the non-presidential party, if that does happen in a midterm, would be the most such losses since 1934. It highlights some of the Democrats' struggle in the Senate this year. Beto O'Rourke, as mentioned, failed to win his bid to defeat Ted Cruz. Democrats did retain their seats in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and West Virginia. All of those were states that Trump did win in 2016. And Democrats also picked up Nevada, where Jackie Rosen defeated incumbent Dean Heller. All told, Republicans are on track to expand the size of their majority by a couple of or 3 seats, and the chamber has moved significantly to the right, especially on social issues like abortion. So implications, I'll highlight 3: legislation, investigations, and confirmations. So for legislation, what we have are 2 factors that are going to tend to promote a lot of gridlock and stalemate in Congress. First of all, the Congress is now more polarized. Some of the relatively more moderate members have been defeated to the extent they were in Congress before, so the 2 parties are further apart. Also, the institutional pattern we now have with the Democrats holding the House and the Republicans holding the Senate, that means the chamber itself is divided between the 2 parties. It's not just the branches. Political science research suggests that combination tends to inhibit lawmaking. So that may be another drag, that institutional factor as well. House Democrats have pledged to push a package of political reforms covering campaign finance, redistricting, restoring the Voting Rights Act, automatic voter registration, anti-corruption legislation. None of those things are likely to become laws in the next Congress, but they do provide a foundation for campaigning and incubating those ideas for the future. A real question will be, can we see any bipartisan deal-making? Will President Trump reach out to the Democrats and, for example, do a deal on infrastructure or on prescription drug prices? I don't think it's impossible, but that will take some skillful political bargaining. There are areas where we may see some legislation. There are must-pass bills, such as raising the debt ceiling, and there are some spending bills that will have to be addressed. Those will give bargaining power to the House Democrats to try to extract some concessions from the GOP because those measures must move. It was a very, very good day for blocking legislation. So a very, very good day for helping protect the ACA from legislative repeal. The Republicans may continue to try to chip away at the ACA through executive action, but the full frontal attack on the ACA is not going to go anywhere in this Congress. We're also not going to see major tax cuts for the wealthy. We're not going to see big cuts in social spending. The House should be in a good position to block those bills. It was also another key measure for entrenching the ACA was that in ballot initiatives in Idaho, Nebraska, and Utah, overwhelmingly passed for Medicaid expansion. So we are seeing more red states begin to embrace this key element of the ACA. The battle over the ACA continues through executive action, through the judiciary, but we are still seeing a slow consolidation of that key law. Lastly, investigations and confirmations. In the House, I expect to see them focusing, particularly because they're not going to be able to legislate on their own, on investigating. The House Democrats will be able to use the subpoena power. They can do that unilaterally without the GOP's buy-in. They can investigate Trump's family finances, issues with Saudi Arabia, issues with Russia, a whole range of issues. It'll be a key challenge for them to use those investigations in a way so that don't backfire and then don't give President Trump something to argue against, but to begin to hold President Trump to account and to have some checks and balances that have been missing the last couple of years. In the Senate, we should expect Mitch McConnell to continue his very aggressive campaign and drive to remake the federal courts in a more conservative direction. That is one of the key powers of the Senate, and I think they will push as aggressively as possible over the next 2 years. I will stop there.
Thank you. Now, Professor Wendy Schiller.
Okay, my timer on. Okay, welcome. I'm going to just build on what's been said by my two colleagues in a couple of different arenas. So what I looked for in last night's results was how would each party be building their infrastructure for the 2020 presidential election. And that I was sort of looking for clues about how the terrain would change for 2020. So one of the things I want to pick up on, certainly I want to address Professor Hooker's comments on race and ethnicity and gender, but I'll go to Professor Patashnik's comments first. On ACA and healthcare, it's really a big deal to have Medicaid expansion even get on the ballot for referendum in some of those states. And that it was approved healthily, big margins for approval. Really, and in addition, that the issue of health care was the #1 issue in the West Virginia Senate race. Joe Manchin ran a lot of commercials on that. And when you think about that, you realize that what Americans want is a government that works. Now, different Americans have very different ideas about the scope of government and about the guarantee of certain particular rights, and they fight about that. But they want government that works. And if there is an opportunity to get health care in some way from the government, they want that opportunity. I think that message is loud and clear to the Republicans. I don't see Donald Trump trying to sort of make that an issue in his campaign in 2020. I think he's going to work to sort of quietly do lip service to undermine it a little bit in the bureaucracy, but he's not going after it because he recognizes that this is a benefit that Americans have come to now expect and rely on, and it was an issue not only in these races I've mentioned, but also in House races. So I think policy-wise, that is not a small thing in the 2020 race. Focusing on how many seats the Democrats won is not a good use of energy. They won the majority. They have a pretty slim margin, but it's enough of an operating margin to do exactly what Erik said, is to thwart any more legislative action to undo the Obama administration's policy program. I disagree a little bit on the investigation strategy. Nancy Pelosi has already said on a phone call apparently with donors and bigwigs in the party, they're not going to try to impeach President Trump, and they're not really going to go after Trump per se. They're going to go after his cabinet, misuse of power, ways that the executive branch is undermining laws that Congress has passed. So anything from food safety to civil rights, those are the things that the Congress, the House can do through oversight. So really calling all these executive branch people in to say, how are you governing? That is the winning strategy for the Democrats, rather than focusing on things like Russia and Saudi Arabia. So they may do a little bit more of that, but they're going to switch gears because all these Congress people who just got elected, their toughest re-election race is typically the next one coming up. They have to protect these people who've already won. So that's one thing, I think, in terms of how much investigation you'll see. The state legislatures, it was a very big mistake in the 2010 races for the Democratic Party to ignore state legislatures. They picked up 635 plus seats in state legislatures in 2010 alone. So the Democrats needed to eat into or erode the Republicans' advantage in the state legislatures, not just for 2020 infrastructure, but for 2022 redistricting. So picking up seats was important. So according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, they picked up 330 seats nationwide. They wanted about 450 seats. They didn't quite get there, but that's still eating into the net advantage of more than 1,100 seats that the Republicans have over the Democrats. They flipped a few state legislatures. They gained control, and there will be more. The women in state legislatures about 24%. They think that's going to go pretty much higher. As a result of this election in state legislatures, and women of color in particular also expected to go higher. So in terms of institutional infrastructure, there are changes to pay really close attention to. In terms of the presidential, and I think the Florida referendum to restore felon voting rights is enormously important moving forward for policy. Not only does it change the potential electoral landscape, depending on how quickly Florida implements this for 2020, but it may have a domino effect in other states in trying to get this passed. And I think that it will start a movement to erode some of the great damage that mass incarceration has done, and also the deprivation of voting rights for people. So that passing by a very big margin, by the way, and we'll have to look at the demographics on that and whether that was a coalition, which I expect, of white people who've gone to jail and African Americans and Latinos who've gone to jail. That is really important. Pay attention to the follow-up on that across states. And Professor Moffitt is the big expert on diffusion of policy on this panel, but it's really important to pay attention to the potential ripple effects for that. So I want to go to the landscape for 2020 politically. Winning the governorships of Michigan and Wisconsin is very important. You remember, Trump won those 3 states by a total of less than 80 or 85,000 votes. So when you think about what having a governor at the helm does to that prospect, it makes the Rust Belt tougher for Donald Trump. Mike DeWine won in Ohio. You can argue that's a big Republican victory, but Mike DeWine was a U.S. Senator from Ohio and Lieutenant Governor. He had a personal reputation that I think thwarted some of the negatives for Trump. We'll see if that carries over to 2020. Winning those states is very important. Winning Kansas, the president's #1 voting fraud guy, Chris Kobach, who had worked hard to restrict voting rights in Kansas, among other things, went down to defeat. That's a signal. It's an important signal. Looking at the landscape of Georgia and Florida, being disappointed by the outcome in Florida is understandable if you are a Democrat and a progressive, and Georgia. But that Georgia is so competitive, given the 2 candidates, is a huge signal that the Democrats are building significant infrastructure in states that have not been competitive for them at the presidential level. The same is true of Arizona. I actually expected Martha McSally to win that seat. Arizona remains relatively conservative, but I still think the closeness of that Senate race also indicates that Arizona is ripe for the picking for the Democrats. So there are spots in the country, and big spots actually, that suggest that the effort to build infrastructure going into 2020 was moderately successful. And thinking about the president, particularly with trade policy, he did very well in farm states because, of course, maybe some of you know, the Republican Congress released a huge subsidy to farmers to shield them from the impact of negative trade policies that made it hard for them to export their goods. That was very productive for them in places like North Dakota. But the manufacturing industry is still suffering under the tariffs, and that affects the Rust Belt. And so we're seeing some reverb on that. You should probably expect to see Trump roll back those tariffs sometime in the next couple of months so that he can undo some of this damage going into 2020. So I would take a holistic picture of this. Lastly, on race, I have 2 minutes left. On race and ethnicity, I'm not surprised that 40% of Latinos voted for Ted Cruz in Texas. George Bush did well among Latinos, and this idea that Latinos are monolithic is a total myth. They're not monolithic at all, and they vary by region, by nation of origin, original nation of origin if they were immigrants, and by their occupation. So I do think that's an important thing to keep in track of for 2020. And in terms of race, the defeat of 2 prominent, well-qualified African Americans at the gubernatorial level is a sting for people who want to see more progress in that area, but the fact that they won the nominations is, again, incremental progress. And the question is, how do the Democrats build on that by recruiting more candidates of color for state legislative offices, for House and Senate offices across the board in 2020 to keep this infrastructure moving, to build it up, and to combat the tone of the Trump administration, or personally President Trump. Last point on this. Now in Washington, there will be an institution that can rebut or confront the president on his most off-the-ranch, racist and xenophobic remarks. And so policy-wise, Trump is pretty much Republican Party. I mean, that's Republican Party policy for the last 10 years. His rhetoric and decorum and demeanor and his very liberal use of the truth is something that the Republicans have been silent on in Washington. That silence doesn't exist anymore. The Democrats will have a huge megaphone to combat these kinds of lies that the president tells from time to time and his use of rhetoric. So he's going to have to gear up for that. It's going to be a new experience for him. It's this singular reason why I'm quite confident Nancy Pelosi will be elected Speaker again. This is not the time to shift gears to a newbie. You need somebody who's experienced, been in the trenches, and knows how to do this, and I think the Democrats recognize that.
Well, let's build on these comments a bit and pick up with your last point. Is this on? So in part last night, there were some notable firsts. The first 2 Muslim American women elected to the House, first 2 Native American women elected to the House, 2 women under the age of 30 going to the House, as well as the first female Republican from Tennessee going to the Senate. I wondered if you could speak about the significance of this in terms of what we call in political science descriptive representation and substantive representation. Will these firsts matter in what we see?
Well, I'll take it first, and then I'll send it to Professor Hooker and Professor Patashnik. Quickly, there's also going to be the first woman senator from Arizona. So that's probably Martha McSally when that's all said and done. So, and there is 2 women representing the state of Nevada now. And that's another really important thing, including the first Latina woman elected to the Senate 2 years ago. So I think there are big strides for women across the board, the House and the Senate. And I think that you have to consider strides both in the Republican and the Democratic Party. It matters that Marsha Blackburn is a woman. It matters that Martha McSally is a woman. And I think you will see policies that are similar in the Republican Party, but the rhetoric and the way that they're described and the way that language is used about women in particular will have to change in the Republican side when you bring in more Republican women into the mix. So I'm expecting that. I don't know that policy will change. They've run on pretty conservative records. But I do think that adding, I think right now it went from 84, I think, to 99 women in the House. And we also have a female, there's already been a governor of Michigan that's a woman, but we now have a woman at the helm there. We have a woman at the helm in Kansas. So it makes a big difference moving forward to thinking about socialization, thinking about what America wants to be, thinking about the nature of the democracy. And I think these are all positive signs on both sides of the aisle.
So I think one of the things that in particular, thinking about women, that I would say is that, the election proved once again is that women are not monolithic, right? And so I think that, a lot of women continue, that there's not a, women don't vote in a particular way. And so I think, how you feel about some of these first probably depends on in some ways what you think is whom you're excited about being elected. I think one of the things that I would take away from those elections, however, is that, to the extent that people don't vote in the U.S., and that particularly for young people, this is often seen, I think, in addition to, right, the barriers that we put into making voting possible, right? So making it difficult for people to vote means that fewer people vote, that as long that the fact that they might feel that they identify with younger candidates who, are of their generation or closer to their generation, I think that is, to that extent, I think descriptive representation in that sense, as well as substantive representation. I mean, we saw some candidates win, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right, who's very dynamic and has, some very progressive ideas that could energize young progressive voters. So I think that to the extent that people see their policy preferences being reflected in people in Congress, that is a good thing in terms of generating turnout.
And there's some political science evidence that just having women in Congress can change the way government works, that controlling for a variety of factors, their seniority in their party, that they can introduce more legislation, be more effective at working across party lines, keeping bills alive even when they're a minority. So of course, women are not a monolith, but there is a style that's been associated with female legislators that is focused on pragmatic getting things done in Congress.
And one last thing, just in terms of descriptives, we have a number of representatives and senators who self-identify as gay, but I'm not sure that we've had a governor who self-identifies as gay, and the governor of Colorado, first elected self-identified, married with children, governor of Colorado. So I think that, and Tammy Baldwin also got reelected relatively easily, which was very interesting. The state that went for Trump in 2016 reelected Tammy Baldwin. So there are, I think it's important not to I don't know what the right word is. You don't want to look at the country and say, we're so divided. Although if you look at the electoral map, you think, wow, we're really divided. But if you look at individual states, you can see a lot of social progress in terms of tolerance. And that is a different dimension than policy agreement and policy outcome. Toleration as a hallmark of the democracy. And you can see it in places that you might otherwise dismiss because they may be Republican or they may be have went for Trump. So if you view the parties as different on tolerance, it's important to look around the country and really delve into what decisions were made by voters in every state to kind of think about where we are, and are we a little bit manipulated by the media and by the political parties in telling us that the world is ending, the democracy is dying, and there's no hope that we can reconcile. When in fact, if you look around at the elections last night, not just the House, there is actually a fair amount of agreement on some basic principles, and I think it's important to recognize that.
So building on that point, Wendy mentioned earlier about the diffusion of policy and thinking about some of the referenda on the ballot in Florida. I wanted to draw attention to a couple of others. In Louisiana, there was jury reform, striking down a vestige of Jim Crow law, which allowed for non-unanimous jury verdicts. Massachusetts also passed the referenda protecting gender identity. So these are issues that are happening at the subnational level, and they're happening at the policy level rather than the electoral level. I wondered if you see these two things, the electoral representative action and the policy action, as separate, as connected, and are there other subnational referenda or policy that we should be keeping our eye on? And ahead.
I'll just start it really quickly. I think what happened in 2016, and it had been happening certainly in the issue of same-sex marriage, as people watched at the state level, and that diffused across the country before the Supreme Court decision. I think after 2016, people who are progressive and thinking about how they wanted to live in their communities realized that they had to look local. That if you rely on the government, got comfortable under Obama for progressives, that you had to actually look at how your local city and towns are governed, your local state are governed, and that there are more opportunities to change policy at the local level and the state level than at the federal level. And you know, Democrats of a certain age sort of look at the federal government as the savior for civil rights in that sense, that the federal government has to intervene to protect for civil rights. But there's, 40 years later, the states are an opportunity to veer from the federal government, to adopt policies that fit the state and fit the constituents. And I think that's what you saw last night. It's just a really hybrid, heterogeneous look at what you want state and local government to do and what you want the federal government to do.
So I would say that I think that actually some of the local and state results are the most exciting. I mean, if you look at New York, for example, which, people reported tons of problems voting in New York City, for, in various precincts, that the fact that they were able to win the state Senate, there'd been a bill to address some of the voting problems that was stalled at the level of, the lower chamber, and now that they won the state Senate, they can put on voting reform in the state. So I think that there is a connection between these victories at the state and local level, and then the possibility of enacting, policy.
And I think we're going to see more and more pressure to focus on the state and local level, because the Roberts Court is basically trying to push policy down to the states and localities in many ways, is scaling back what the federal government can do. And the fact that you also have geographical polarization, you have communities of people who share values at the state and local level, makes it easier for them to organize politically. So for a variety of reasons, the next 10, 20 years, I think a lot of the vibrancy of American democracy will be in the states.
Well, let's build on that polarization idea for a moment and connect it possibly here with turnout. So yesterday was a very high turnout day. The New York Times is estimating that 114 million ballots were cast. This is above the 83 million that were cast in 2014 and the 91 million in 2010. It's not quite at presidential levels, right? There were 138 million ballots cast in 2016, but there was a lot of action going on yesterday. And I wonder, we focus a lot on the downside of partisanship and polarization. Is turnout the upside?
Yeah. So exactly as you said, the upside is a high level of civic engagement, which is great for our democracy, but it also has consequences for the way our elections work. So one of the reasons we did not have the massive blue wave election is when waves typically happen, it's because enthusiasm is asymmetric. One side, the out party, is very enthusiastic and all their voters come out and they vote. And the other side is demoralized knowing that they're not going to do so well and they don't vote. And turnout is lower, but that creates a big, shift in the political landscape. When you have a more divided country, you have enthusiasm on both sides. There was obviously all the constituencies that were upset about Trump and his rhetoric and the actions turned out, but there were many people on the other side that were galvanized by the Kavanaugh hearing and other kinds of events, and they also turned out. And so the result is we have a very engaged citizenry right now.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, this goes way back, and I think I said this in 2016 as well. The first big campaign was to break with Britain or not, and then to ratify the Constitution, and it was a pretty polarizing campaign. The Federalist Papers were the first sort of campaign document. So in every era, in every century, parties exist to win elections. They are teams. If you're on one team, you cannot be on the other team. This is the nature of American politics, and the way that our electoral system is structured, single-member districts, really contributes to this sort of dichotomy, and we go through periods of polarization. What's interesting is at the state level, in particular for budget matters, for example, most, if not all states, have the requirement that you have to balance the budget. You can't leave deficit. You can't run deficits. You have to come to the table eventually. Well, Illinois did not come to the table, but other than Illinois, you have to come to the table and figure it out. And that is something that is fundamentally different at the state level. So it forces states, even in the age of polarization, to come to the table and get something done. And that is why I think, as Erik says, states will become increasingly the place that voters look to solve and address fundamental problems that they're concerned about.
Just on this issue of polarization, I think one of the real downsides, I agree, I think turnout and voter engagement and enthusiasm are the upside. I think the downside has been that some of the institutions that we need for democracy to work are then seen through a partisan lens, right? So this question of House oversight, the fact that Congress is supposed to, in the U.S. system, play its role as a check on the executive has basically been abandoned in the first 2 years of the Trump presidency because you had a totally Republican Congress, right? So if we look at it in terms of it's not a Democratic House going after Trump, but it's actually a House actually taking on its role that it had abandoned of doing oversight on the presidency. So I think that that's the danger of polarization, that we lose sight of the way in which democratic institutions are supposed to be able to work independent of party allegiances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to add a local note, if you think about the Rhode Island races last night, it was a big night for the Democratic Party in Rhode Island, and the Democratic Party already sort of runs Rhode Island, but these margins were bigger than they've been. This is a state that voted 40% for Trump in 2016. Gina Raimondo won handily, and she exceeded her expectations. She's almost at 53%, 52.5%. So in that sense, it was just a big run the table for the Democrats. And if you're progressive, you think, yes, that's great. But actually, if you think more deeply, you think it's never a good thing, Massachusetts has the same problem, to be so one-party dominated. You really want competition between the parties at every level, and there's no real competition at all now in Rhode Island. It will empower Gina Raimondo, who's the first woman governor of Rhode Island and the first woman governor reelected in Rhode Island, vis-a-vis the state legislature, which will be an interesting dynamic for this state. We haven't seen that quite before. The state legislature tends to be dominant, but I think she's going to be more forceful. And so when you think about that, you have to think about polarization, and you don't like it when people are too divided. But then again, if you're on the team that wins, you really like it a lot.
Well, I also think it's important to distinguish analytically between two things. One is polarization, which we've been talking about, a very important phenomenon. And then the other is the parity of electoral competition, how closely divided the two parties are. And that's the other thing that strikes me, is that neither of these two parties at the national level particularly have been able to win a durable majority. And that has led to this trench warfare in domestic policy, where we have tax cuts and then tax increases, where we make major strides in some policy area and then it's eroded. And we go back and forth without the kind of durable gains that we saw during the New Deal era and some of the Great Society legislation. And until our politics fundamentally changes, our elections are likely to remain highly competitive, where each party has a very tenuous hold on a majority, may not be able to keep its majority very long, and there are different incentives that arise from that. There's a temptation for a temporary majority to overreach, knowing that it's going to lose its power very quickly. And we've seen that with George Bush. We saw that in some ways with Obama, and certainly with Trump. And then there's a punishment from the electorate because responsiveness is there. And so we are in a period now that is quite unusual. You have to go back a while in American history to see such an even divide between the two parties, where we go back and forth in every election cycle, it seems.
Last question, then we'll open it up to yours. So, building on Erik's point and tying it back to where Juliet started with us, in addition to parties and partisanship and polarization as a mobilizing force for turnout, political psychology also reveals that fear is a mobilizer also. And the rhetoric, the fear-based rhetoric around the caravan that you mentioned, there was arguments that there is fear about losing health benefits too. How do you see the current dynamics continuing the cultivation of fear as a political strategy for mobilization in a time when votes, each individual vote counts?
Well, I mean, certainly the president ran on fear. He continues to fearmonger. I think that is a drumbeat. But I wonder in some ways if there's just underlying alignment with his perspective on America, either driven by racism or general fear of the other, that sort of says, oh, well, I agree with him anyway, so then now I have an excuse because there's this individual thing that he's pointing out to me that I have to be afraid of. But in fact, I pretty much agree with him anyway, so I'm using that as a way of justifying my position because, there's this. But that's the point of having the House be controlled by the Democrats now, and Nancy Pelosi is a very media-savvy person, is that every time he comes out with this stuff, there's going to be a response, and it's going to be pretty loud. It's going to be echoed by 225 or 226 people. That's a big response to these kinds of fear-mongering efforts on the part of the president. But you can't, fear is never successful unless there's underlying dispositions to believe it.
Can I just say something? I think the role of the media is going to be very important. I think that they have not responded to these fear-mongering tactics as well as they could, right? So there's a way in which I think, there were tons of stories about the caravan, even though folks in the media recognized that they were still, not even in Mexico, and that this wasn't really a threat. So I think that there's a real crisis in terms of this issue, because I think the fear-mongering gets amplified when it gets reported simply as so-and-so said this without any sort of sense of like, well, maybe you don't need really to be so afraid of this. But I think because of the way the media is afraid of being accused of being biased, but that it makes it difficult for there to be independent, reporting that can dilute some of the fear mongering.
Yeah, and there's an effect in response to some of President Trump's suggestions or proposals. So he instructed the military, sent troops to the border. There's something called posse comitatus, so there's all sorts of reasons why the troops can't do certain kinds of legal enforcement activities, prevents the military from doing that, but immigration is a federal responsibility, and he instructed them to build detention camps and to start building them on the day of the election. And so he was, I guess, politely told by the Pentagon that wasn't going to happen. So there's an interesting resistance, I think, within the bureaucracy, particularly the Pentagon, to some of the things that Trump wants to do with military forces in his effort and his campaign to generate fear. And part of that is just sort of integrity on part of the military, but the other part is that the military has a lot of soldiers of color. They have a lot of African Americans, a lot of Latinas, Latino men, women, and I think there is a real sensitivity to some of these, the most sort of extreme rhetoric that the president spews. And there's an effort not only to publicly block it and not do the things he's saying, but also internally to make sure that the military knows that its troops can feel more confident that it doesn't buy into it.
Well, let's take your questions. We have a microphone. Yes. So here.
I was wondering, you mentioned the Proposition 4 in Florida and how this would allow millions of formerly incarcerated people to be able to vote, but I'm wondering what the likelihood is that this is actually implemented with a Republican, very racist governor.
That's a great question. You know, I think that's that's going to be up to activists putting pressure on the legislature in Florida, and I don't know exactly the wording of the ballot in terms of implementation. I don't know what the instructions are to the legislature once this is passed. But I don't think the media is going to let go of it, and I don't think the millions of people who voted for Gillum are going to let go of it. And as I said, the Republicans are facing a different landscape in 2020, and the president's going to want to win Florida. And the people who want this ballot enfranchised aren't going to be the people who want Trump, and Trump isn't going to want to have it happen. But that doesn't mean that there won't be tremendous pressure electorally to make sure that it does happen. Certainly the Democratic presidential candidate is going to make an issue of it. So I think there'll be lawsuits, there'll be all sorts of efforts to obstruct it. But I think you can't ignore it. I think it passed by 62 or 63%.
Yeah.
You just can't ignore that if you're the Republicans in Florida. You can try, but I don't think you'll succeed.
It's also worth mentioning that this came about because there's these long-standing activism on the ground in Florida around this issue. And so, you know, those organizations that have been working for years to get this on the ballot are obviously, you know, now that they've gotten this, are going to use this to try to make sure that it's implemented.
And there are a lot of people who are white who are convicted felons in Florida. So there is race involved, but there's also, and they may be able to vote for Trump, but they want to vote too. Yeah, and also, yeah, that's right. It is interesting. And the Republican barely carried the top of the ticket, so it was very close.
Two quick questions on the gender dynamics of the election. One is, what's striking is that Trump really owns the Republican Party, and the moderates lost, and significant part of the blue wave was caused by the defection of suburban Republican women. And so one question is, how does the Democratic Party hold on to that going forward? And is there a realignment in this? And the other is that all the news isn't so great at the local level. I think Alabama and West Virginia passed blatant challenges to Roe versus Wade by declaring abortion illegal. And that sets up an interesting set of politics around the court with the Republican. So I'm wondering comments on those two issues.
I'll take it first. I think in the case of Alabama and West Virginia, one of them is no public funding for abortion, state funding, and one is outlawed. West Virginia, I think, outlawed. So you're right. Now, is there actually effectively abortion offered in those two states? I think in Alabama, no. It's almost impossible to get an abortion, and so West Virginia. So in terms of policy change, it's so bad there anyway for availability and access that I'm not sure it's going to have a huge impact on policy. But yes, abortion is a huge divide in this country. North Dakota, for example, you can't get an abortion. Idaho, you can't get. I mean, there's many states now where effectively there's no access to abortion. And it will take it all to the court. My guess is that the court ultimately sends abortion back to the states, that they basically revoke the federal protection for it and say it's up to states. And that will take mobilization and activism at the state level to reinstate access to that. I think that's right. And then for suburban women, if the Democrats go too far off the ranch in terms of spending, and suburban Republican women don't like budget deficits in general because research shows they're typically responsible for some of the household budgeting. It's true. And second, if they have to focus on bread and butter issues, FDR issues, Johnson issues, the way that the Democrats have managed to win and pull together and sustain their coalitions in the past, which is to make government more efficient, but focus on the things that government can do for people that people need from government. And if they can keep their eye on that kind of prize, I think they can do a good job of holding the line. But you're right. You know, the Republicans are going to adapt, and they're going to recruit good candidates in those suburban districts that appeal to those very women, and that'll be a tough thing for the Democrats.
Thank you. Professor Schiller just mentioned about the bread and butter issues that Democrats have traditionally offered to all of us. Having in mind the fact that we not only have a deficit, we have a huge deficit, and in all likelihood, with the increase in interest, among other things, and who knows what else, the deficit is going to grow even larger. With that in mind, I just wonder, about what the policy that the Democrats will have available to them to offer, and don't they have to offer some attractive policy to their voters besides blocking Trump and attacking Trump, which obviously has worked to some minimum extent, but isn't that going to be a requirement for the Democrats, and aren't they going to be blocked by money issues, among other things?
Well, I think that there are opportunities to do things without spending. I will expect the Democratic House to push for minimum wage increases and other kinds of policies that will address the material well-being of people without spending money. But I think you're right. I think we're going to see eventually a push on an effort to control prescription drug prices, which is a pocketbook issue that can be done through regulatory power without spending. So those are some of the strategic ways that the Democrats can try to show they're making a tangible difference, even though they're constrained by deficits. Infrastructure is one where it's going to be difficult to do anything without spending, and I think that is enough of a jobs program, and there's enough of a chance for bipartisan agreement that we will see some effort to come up with a funding mechanism that is fiscally responsible, perhaps some still form of public-private partnership, perhaps some new revenue source. But if you're pointing to really the Democrats' Party's biggest structural problem as they go forward the next 20, 30 years, which is this fiscal vice that they're in. Programs like Medicare and Medicaid are rising, Social Security are rising in costs. The Republicans have constrained taxes. It's going to be very difficult to finance major new domestic spending initiatives. So how will that be done? Over the long run, and I acknowledge it's not politically feasible in the near term, but over the long run, I think the Democrats are going to have to make a strategic adjustment on the revenue side. Relying on high marginal tax rates on the wealthy, although it makes sense from the standpoint of combating income inequality, is not generating enough revenue to finance welfare state expansions that are needed to actually provide the services. The rest of the OECD world has VATs, has consumption taxes, has other revenue sources. We can think of carbon taxes. Some of those taxes are more economically efficient than income taxes or payroll taxes. It's difficult to see how that would move forward in the current environment, but this game where the Democrats raise marginal tax rates on the wealthy when they're in power and the Republicans lower them when they're in power is not, over time, creating a sustainable revenue source to actually finance the kind of spending initiatives that are going to be needed to address the problems of the 21st century. So eventually, I think the U.S. is going to have to join the rest of the world and fundamentally transform its revenue structure.
And I would say good luck with that. It's not going to happen. At least,
not soon.
Not soon. And Obama signed the Bush tax cuts. You know, Obama didn't raise taxes. He kept the income level, not as much as Trump, but he certainly did. So he in 2012 in December, he just went, okay, all right, let's do it. So I think that's right. And this has been a strategy for those of us who are old enough to remember that David Stockman constructed this strategy in the mid-1980s as an employee of Ronald Reagan, ran OMB, and said, okay, if we create the deficits that will squeeze the federal budget, you can't expand the social welfare state, we won't have the money. But much to his chagrin, they found ways of expanding the social welfare state and not paying for it. I think that's a huge part of this election is that, you know, if the Republicans had kept the House, they would have gone after Medicare and Medicaid in a much more aggressive way legislatively, and they would have succeeded. Although I'm not sure Trump going into 2020 would want to have cut Medicare or Social Security. But now the Trump administration will use the regulatory process to start to squeeze those entitlement programs. Put exactly like Reagan did. Put more eligibility requirements, put more expectations. There's work requirements for Medicaid across states that have been in effect, but they're spreading more. They're going to try to squeeze out money and cut people from the rolls, as Reagan did. And they're going to, unless the House pays careful attention to that, they're going to succeed at doing that. So that's one way in which they'll claim to, you know, to try to save money. But you're right, and you can argue that the domestic policy arena at the federal level may be saturated. In other words, it may be that the federal government does as much as the federal government can do with what it has on domestic social welfare policy. It depends on your ideological bent, but if there's a sort of capacity argument and we don't have any money, that's again where states, particularly states with healthy economies, may want to and are starting to do more. So what will happen is, I don't think at the federal level there will be tax increases, but I think states are going to start to get pretty creative with their tax structures. And I think that there may be a limit. I know this may not be popular. There just may be a limit to what the federal government does for people in that sort of FDR, Lyndon Johnson way. And we may have run up against it, not just because of the Republicans' tax policy and spending and deficits, but for deficits that have been growing for 30 years.
I think the other point, though, is that people don't seem to care about deficits. I mean, you know, that's the other reality that seems to have been revealed by the tax cut, right? That folks are fine with deficits, actually, seemingly. So I think it's going to be very difficult to make that argument. I mean, I think this is going to be a big debate within the Democratic Party, because you already had people saying, look, you know, we need to not worry about deficits because clearly other people are not, so why are we constraining ourselves in this way? So I think it's actually going to be a very big debate.
Another question here?
You all can help me with this, but in my readings, I'm a retiree, so I read the Financial Times and The Economist and occasionally the New York Times, and all of those very solid sources of information are talking increasingly about the nature of work and what's going to happen to work. And article in the Financial Times this morning. What are our politicians doing about that? Just think, is it really a possibility that we won't have much work after 20, 30 years from now? How are we going to function as a society? How are we going to look at work? What are we men going to do when you no longer need our arms and need minds and relationships? Do any politicians talk about this? Do you talk about it in the political science field? Thank you. And if you think I'm crazy, okay, but I keep wondering about it.
Well, our former colleague, Darrell West, who left here in 2009, has a book out called The Future of Work, so he's thinking about it. Marco Rubio, if you want to look to somebody who's been thinking about this and who mentioned it quite a bit on the 2016, Marco Rubio on the 2016 campaign trail, Trump was sort of taking all about bringing coal back and tariffs, and Rubio said, that's not the future of work. We have to radically rethink the way we train, the way we educate our children, the economy is changing much faster than we can get a grip on it, and we're going to wake up one day and the jobs that we are going to try to protect aren't going to exist. So there are some people talking about it, and Rubio was very articulate about it actually in 2016. Well, I mean, I think Obama had other things to do, you know, like save the economy when he first came in. But I think this is seen as a sort of extra structural issue for government right now. And as Erik says, they're so short-term in their thinking, it's hard to imagine that they'll take it on. But
yeah, I think this is an issue that's currently at the level of academic research and magazines and think tanks. And, you know, people are beginning to think about universal basic income and other safety nets that we might need.
Ordinary people.
Yeah.
They know something's happened, but they don't know how to talk about it, how to relate to it, how their leaders are handling it.
Yeah.
That's just me.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about, you know, structural changes in the economy due to automation, technological change, that are actually even more fundamental than globalization. And those are major, major forces that are going to be not only changing the level of work demanded, but the wage structure. So I think, one of the things that may happen is that there may still be jobs, but it's going to be increasingly difficult, accelerating the trend we're seeing today, to have an income to support a family without advanced education. And that's going to put tremendous pressure on the American political process. And how do we address that, particularly when some of the jobs that will be available, such as elder care and others, are seen as gendered? And how will we prepare men for a changing, more service-oriented economy? Those are, for sure, some of the big challenges of the next 30 years. I don't think the policy environment is focusing on them urgently today. They're tomorrow's problems, but researchers are beginning to think about them.
And to build on that in two ways, one area where I do see political discussion on the future of work is at the subnational level, the governors. Some of the governors are paying attention, especially as it relates to education, because education constitutes such a big percentage of state budgets, and there is real thought going into are we preparing our students in ways that are amenable to work, right? And what will work look like? And I'll also note on an academic level, the Taubman Center has restructured its survey research and its poll, and we are going into the field later this week, and we have a whole battery of questions on exactly that, the future of work, and the anxiety.
Information. I go over to robotic lectures there, and I never see anybody from this department.
Yeah.
I'm curious.
You
Do
know,
you talk to each other?
We have started, actually. We've done it twice. And in part, it was the robotics folks came to us about the ethical issues that are involved here, and really inviting a conversation between the development of robotics and the ethical implications, some of which are absolutely political, but also thinking about what it means for various aspects of inequality too. So those conversations have started.
And
Thank you for your question.
And the MPA program for Brown students has an elective on the future of work, actually, this year. So. There you
And
go.
Daryl West is coming back in April to give a talk on the future of work. Yes, April 10th. Mark your calendar. We had a question here?
Yeah,
Microphone?
my question is 52.5% last night. I'll ask the panel. I'll say it again to the microphone. 52.5% last night for Governor Raimondo. She was already a national figure. She had already started to plant those seeds. Certainly her operation this year, fundraising, the commercials she threw out. Is she a presidential watch list person at this point? And what will it take for her to elevate her own presence as someone who could run for president?
Wendy?
That's a great question. I think what was impressive about the Raimondo campaign, yes, she raised a lot of money, and yes, she ran a lot of commercials. Two other things. She started vigorously campaigning in June. So the first poll really comes out, and she's within this margin of error, pretty much tied with Alan Fung. And she got out the door. I mean, she had a huge get-out-the-vote operation, particularly as she had a primary against Matt Brown. But it was a vigorous, energetic, very determined campaign from the get-go. She never let up. She never took any time off. And they knocked on doors, and they basically didn't just say, well, do you support her? We work on the campaign. They were like, okay, who are you? Did you vote? When you vote? Here's where you vote. They really, I think, fine-tuned a campaign that could be replicated at a broader level for primaries, let's just say. But I think coming from a state this small, even if she does have a lot of national recognition at the moment, I think makes her, she's young, a VP candidate, and she can balance the ticket on gender, but she's got really good, strong ties with industry, with business, with Wall Street, which was a subject of criticism for her in the campaign, but would be a bonus for her if she were going to offset a more liberal top-of-the-ticket person. But I don't see her getting to the top of the ticket from Rhode Island. I think being the governor of Rhode Island. Maybe if she runs for Senate someday, should Jack Reed or Sheldon Whitehouse step down, but considering Pastore and Green served until their, I think, 80s and 90s, I do not see either one of them making room for anybody else. But I think she will get much stronger press, and she'll become part of the conversation, I think, for VP, not yet president. Let me go back to also work. I also think we have to be really concerned about racial divides in terms of the future of work. Certainly, immigration, Latino, African American, You have to think to yourself, there's a lot of work to be done to just get parity in education at the elementary and secondary level now. That's just education, basic education. Thinking about the communities that will be able to pivot to this new kind of work expectation more quickly, you think they're going to be affluent communities. And so both the income gap and the race gap and the ethnicity gap will get exacerbated if we don't try to do something about it. So
I think the raw nationalism is going to die.
Yeah.
To your issue.
Yeah.
Thanks. I actually have two questions, and then one is rebounding on what you just said, Professor Schiller. If we have to work on class and race in terms of education, but in parallel, we also have gonna have a slew of more conservative courts. What does that mean for the future of affirmative action? There is a case right now that's making its way to SCOTUS. And then similarly, I think there was a pivot in the late 90s, early 2000s in LGBTQ rights, where we went from states deciding the issue to courts because it got stalled at the state level because there were some conservative states that didn't want to pass marriage equality. And so now we're facing this for trans rights very acutely. There are some states that are just not going to pass this protections for trans people. So how is that going to work with more conservative courts?
Well, I think that progressives are going to have to really be mindful of the changing legal environment. One of the reasons I think that progressives got caught flat-footed with the ACA is that the conversation about what was permissible under the law and under the Constitution took place only among fellow progressives. And the court has changed, and their understanding of the Constitution is different than is been taught in many mainstream law schools. And so, for example, we've seen a massive change in how the Commerce Clause is going to be interpreted. We've seen massive change in federalism. The core New Deal tax and spend power of Congress, the Article I powers, they are intact. So, you know, that is going to, I think, require more robust constituency building. In the past, there were times when progressives tried to avoid tax increases and tried to do other kinds of things. They thought it would be easier politically. And now some of those other avenues are cut off due to the court. And so progressives are going to have to go back and actually build coalitions for new expenditures, new taxation if that's necessary in order to fund those programs. But some of the other kinds of provisions that were used to combat inequality over the last 30, 40 years, affirmative action, reliance on the Commerce Act, mandating things to the states, without having the unfunded mandate to the states, the court's cutting back on those things. So other avenues are going to have to be the main pathway in the future.
I would just add to that I think that the downside to this, to the fact that a lot of these battles are going to be happening at the state level is precisely what you point out. That there's going to be a lot of asymmetry in what access vulnerable populations have to rights, right? So if we go to a position where abortion is going to be available in some states, not in others, trans rights in some, not in others, various other kinds of protections, I think it's going to have a real, it's going to be really, really asymmetrical geographically in terms of who has protection.
Yeah.
Just go ahead. Susan.
Go. Well, so I was going to speak to the broader structural issue here. I can't really speculate on what might happen with the courts, but I think in this in this partisan era when there's they're competitive races or when the elections are tight, also I think we really are going to see just a lot of action in all spaces of contestation, right? I think it'll be at the courts, it'll be at the local level. So my broader prediction, or my more general prediction for what comes, is there's just going to be a lot of contestation in a lot of different kinds of spaces within the next decade. We can also imagine how this lots of contestation in lots of different places can lead to both opportunities for groups representing marginalized communities, but it can also represent I don't want to say danger, but some costs, right? It's expensive to fight in all of these places in all of these different ways. And so I'm not sure how this, contestation in different spaces is going to play out. It could go either way.
And then we'll get to your question. I know you're patiently waiting. Just really, additionally, really quickly, is that, Madison said expand the sphere of influence because he wanted to dilute the power of one single group to oppress any other. But in your generation, I would suggest that if you expand the sphere, the arena, as social media does, expanding the arena where everybody knows about these laws that discriminate or these actions that are taken that deprive people of rights, you've seen it's the sort of good side and bad side of social media, but in the terms of mobilization and also corporate business fear, the good news about the fact that you go to every city in America and it's all the same stores is that things have been consolidated. So companies are feeling the pain when they're in one state and they're doing business there, and that state is discriminatory. We've seen this over and over again where it just spreads, and people say, I'm not going to buy your product anymore because you're doing business with a state that discriminates. So that's either the NBA or the NFL. I'm using sports analogies. This is enormously powerful. I said this 2 years ago. It's even more powerful now. So it's a new medium of organization. It's a new arena of contestation that Susan's talking about, and it's very powerful. And it seems to me progressives, conservatives sort of stay out of it. Like white supremacy spreads through it, which is terrible. On the other side, progressive energy and power spreads through it and has been effective. So it's important to recognize that that's new to American democracy, and we haven't quite processed that yet. But I think it's a viable competitor for power in terms of protecting those kind of rights or fighting for those rights. So I know you had a question.
Thank you. This is a future question for our next election. I saw on late night TV the night before the election a senator who I'd never even heard of before, but that's really my issue, not her issue, and that's Senator Amy Klobuchar. And I was very, very impressed with everything she said and how she maintained decorum and seemed to me to be, in my opinion, fairly presidential in how she approached that late night TV show. So there's her, and there's also Nikki Haley. And I'm wondering if somebody can comment on both of these, I think, amazing women in their future.
So I'll just go first really quickly. I'll take Nikki Haley first. Nikki Haley is a conservative Republican from South Carolina. She had a very rough time in her first election campaign. She was single later than most female politicians. She had been married. She got married by the time she was running, but her opponent dredged up her dating history and how many boyfriends she had, and also she was ethnic, and so they dug that up, and she withstood that barrage, and she won, and then she was reelected. So I think she's pretty tough. And she did a pretty good job at the UN for the Trump administration. She got out of the Trump administration just in time. He seems to like her still. So I do think people like Nikki Haley in the Republican Party, and there'll be more of them now. Marsha Blackburn is now elected. There'll be some very credible, viable, tough women who may vie for the presidential nomination, but they wouldn't be able to do it until 2024. Klobuchar is interesting because in the Kavanaugh hearings, Kamala Harris sort of asserted herself, and she'd been sort of in the game asserting herself on the Judiciary Committee for a while. She's pretty savvy with social media. But it was Amy Klobuchar's exchange with Kavanaugh that really lit fire, really caught fire, because she had sort of been in the wings, it took 6 months for her. She was a senator for 6 months before they settled the Al Franken case against Norm Coleman the first time. And she sort of slightly, stealthily climbed the ladder, but that exchange brought her a new level of visibility. So there is buzz about her. Tim Pawlenty on the Republican side tried to run for Minnesota. It's a tough state, except for if you're Walter Mondale and Hubert Humphrey. So maybe it's not a tough state to run for president. But I think there's going to be a lot of interesting alternatives, and I think that the Democratic Party will skew younger. I think the older women who are vying, like Elizabeth Warren, who's coming today to Brown, I think it's going to be a bit of a tougher sell, exactly for what Juliet, Professor Hooker said, and what Erik, Professor Patashnik said, and Susan, Professor Moffitt. The young people left in the room, there has to be a connection.
Where are you?
Where are you? There has to be a connection and a resonance. And I think Amy Klobuchar represents that new generation of bench for the Democratic Party, and she'll try to take advantage of this momentum for as long as she can.
Do you think it's possible, now that the Democrats are in power in the House, that they'll be passing some kind of legislation to protect the special counsel?
You mean successfully pass legislation?
Yes.
No.
Still a Senate.
I think what they'll do is, if there are moves by Attorney General Sessions, for as long as the Attorney General, it could be like a week.
Let me check Twitter.
Yeah, before Lindsey Graham is appointed Attorney General but I think that Pelosi is really determined as a future Speaker, if she is elected Speaker, and I think she will be, to make sure that whatever the Democrats do, they do it with a message in mind that resonates with voters. So if the Justice Department tries to limit Mueller in any concrete way, they'll do an oversight hearing, and they'll get a lot of press for that. And that will be the way that they try to sort of push back against the administration to curtail Mueller. But she doesn't want it to be the big linchpin of their agenda, because they can't succeed with that legislation. And that's energy and time they could be spending on things that they might be able to succeed on.
Just to add to that, I think something that doesn't speak directly to this, in terms of, I agree that they can't protect him because they only have the House. But one thing that will change is that the House Intelligence Subcommittee will not be headed by Devin Nunes, right? That they'll be actually
will not be headed.
Right. They'll actually be able to support him, as opposed to try to, detract from the work that he's doing.
Yeah, it's very, very important, that takeover, I think. Bless you.
There was another question.
Do you have a question?
Well, it was just a comment.
Wait a minute. Thank you so much.
It was just a comment, if I may. In the 60s, Herbert Marcuse was talking about automation taking jobs away. And here we are, almost 60 years later, talking about the same thing, and the country's grown and the number of employed people are grown. So we don't know what the future's going to bring. Technology's brought a lot of jobs. And while we're losing jobs in certain areas, we may gain jobs in other areas.
And that's what the research is really trying to figure out right now. So there have been shifts. But one of the graphs, though, showed that there's the change is happening, and where the jobs are leaving are kind of like the middle of the distribution, right? So a raise, upward tick in the service industry jobs, an upward tick in the high-tech jobs, but the hollowing out of some of the middle or management sorts of jobs too, or manufacturing kinds of jobs. So that's why it really does raise ethical issues, as well as economic issues, as well as education issues, as well as political issues, as we try to really understand the dynamics of what are happening. It is not just the wholesale jobs are going away, but it is a transformation. And it's a transformation that's happening in different ways in different kinds of sectors. And those sectors then have geographic components to them also.
Well, we had that in the Industrial Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but you pointed out something really important, which is that the workforce has grown dramatically since the 1960s. Through women going into the workforce in a really regular way, and also opening up in terms of combating discrimination against African Americans and Latinos, among others, in terms of workforce opportunities. So the pool of people who need a job is much bigger, and that's the scary part, I think, of this scenario, particularly for people who are on the lower end of the income scale. And you go to the supermarket now, and there's self-checkout. Or CVS on Thayer Street, self-checkout. I don't use a self-checkout because I worry that's somebody's job. But I had a long conversation with somebody who explained to me in CVS that no, that in fact it makes them more productive, because if they don't have to stand there waiting for somebody to check stuff out, they can do lots of other things around the store, and that there had been no layoffs or nobody was fired because they brought these machines in. So, but you think about all the ways in which you used to speak to a human being, and now you never can get a human being. And Susan's right. We don't know enough about what happens to those jobs that disappear. And are there other jobs that open up for those same people who might have done the jobs that have disappeared?
One thing we haven't heard much about lately within the political sphere is what we're doing to the earth and climate control. And NPR's done a number of series on how many animals and insects are being killed off, and the number of species that are being destroyed. And so, what does this do to the political people? What's your prediction about that?
Well, I would just tell you to look at you look at, New York Times, CNN, Politico, just an NCSL, National Council of State Legislators website today, and look at the map. And you look at the map and you see the blue is all on coasts and the red is everywhere else, literally everywhere else. So until we start seeing serious drought, like the 1930s in the Farm Belt states, for example, or seeing, huge blizzardy snowstorms, which we sometimes see in New York, or floods that you've seen, hitting the red states who sort of say, we don't accept the premise of climate change, in ways that make them think there might be a connection between policy and what's happening to our farms and what's happening to our lives, I think it's going to be a very difficult sell.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about ballot referendums, and there were a number of energy and climate ones on the ballot that didn't do so well. So I'm just looking quickly. Washington voters rejected a carbon tax again. There was a renewable energy mandate that went down to defeat in Arizona. There were a number of them. And I think, as Wendy said, the issue has resonance at an abstract level, but it is not tangibly affecting people's lives in a way that they're prepared to make the hard choices yet.
Except in Rhode Island, where we did pass the green, what was it called, the green economy and energy.
Oh, the bond.
The bond. We
Yes.
passed that. But you talk to people who are in Matunic, and they've been moving their houses back every single year. The people in Matunic have to move their houses back. Sooner or later, they're going to be at the highway. There'll be no beachfront. So I think that is just a geographic and political intersection that is going to be a very difficult thing to crack.
There was some speculation, I think, before the election results that in Florida in particular, the environment would be, an issue, particularly with all the red tide and the other issues that have been happening there. It doesn't seem certainly to have had that effect, but I think there's possibilities there, because obviously in a state like Florida, it's one of those where you're going to see some of those issues. So I agree with Wendy. I think, unfortunately, this is one of those things where it's unlikely to rise to the top of the agenda until people start seeing the effects quite literally.
It is higher on younger voters' agendas than older voters' agendas. So this one could rise in importance as that cohort rises in its political activism too. Last question?
Oh, we have two questions. So you wanted Susan, it was one on the left, one on the right?
Let's do.
Going off of that point about younger voters, as one of the students left in the room, I'm not sure if the numbers are in yet about the young vote, 18 to 25-ish, but not yet. But at least among people of my generation, I've heard about it also being a referendum on young people caring and young people voting and politicians actually speaking to young people's interests. What do you think is the kind of psychological response to this election? Do you think most people are feeling disappointed or energized on both sides, kind of this expectation of a blue wave, but maybe more of a trickling? If you could speak to that.
Well, I'm the oldest one, right? So I'm the oldest one on this panel, so I'll speak first, because I'll put my crotchety old person hat on. Your generation is a fairly immediate gratification kind of group.
What do you really think, Wendy?
So I mean, I have fought battles. I have won. I have been on the winning side and the losing side over a long period of time. So I recognize, as I said before, building infrastructure politically takes time. And instead of saying it wasn't good enough, we didn't do A, B, and C, which the media will want you to read and click on, say to yourself, this was, if you are progressive, a very strong move forward. You've captured an institutional control of government. And what can we do to build on this? That is what I would suggest reading this election as, and making sure that young people realize that elections work, that many millions more people voted, that the Russians did not manage to mess it up so far, and that the results have been accepted. People have conceded. Yes. People have said, congratulations, I'm sorry, I won, I lost. And the world has, America is still okay today. And I think really focusing on that elections can still work to change political control at the moment without violence, that is super important. And that's the message that I would take away.
And I would just add that I think it's important also to think about voting as one of many things that one can do to be politically engaged, right? So, everybody who went out and voted and things didn't change in all the ways that you wanted them, that didn't mean that, as Wendy said, that it was a loss or that there's nothing to do until the next time you can vote. And in some cases, I think it's also important to keep in mind that the downward effects might not be obvious. So people who are, I used to live in Texas, and I've talked to a lot of people who are disappointed that Beto didn't win, but who also are saying, look, there are some House seats flipped. All the appeals courts in Texas are now run by Democrats, which is a huge change and will affect people's immediate lives. Like, there are things that were changed because people came out and voted.
Okay, last question.
Yeah, as I listened, I kind of wondered about a few things. One was, this notion of what Gina Raimondo did here in terms of community colleges and trying to attract the youth vote in terms of, this investing in them in terms of colleges. And I'm wondering if the key to getting more youth involved just across the board, and also parents of those same youth, is the notion of things that are going to eradicate student debt. Because that seems to be an issue that affects people across the board, not just youth and kids, but also, parents that are often contributing or in some cases completely paying for that. That was one thought. I guess another thought, and I wondered, another thought was this notion that, however nauseating it seems that over the years the Republicans have had a consistently nauseating story that they beat to death over and over and over again. Nevertheless, it's still a story.
Okay, we do need a question.
And I'm wondering, for Democrats, what the story will be, what the story can be, instead of simply having issues. In other words, not having what I would call a tied-together story or a narrative.
I'll just launch really quickly. I'll take the last question first. The reason they won last night was because they didn't have a national unifying story. They allowed candidates to adapt to their districts, to run messages that varied across districts. They allowed a lot of different kinds of people. They were, in Lee Atwater's words, the big tent. They were smart about that. Democrats have a latent majority, meaning they have a majority when they can pull it together and wake it up. But it's hard to do, and it's naturally harder to do than the Republicans. So letting people shape their platforms to local elections is super important. Second, your point about Gina Raimondo is really important about the parents. I think the reason her numbers went way up is that the economy plus educational initiatives mean that more people can stay in Rhode Island. And Rhode Islanders don't like to leave. It's a beautiful place to live. They like their kids to be able to live here and work here and get educated here. And the fact that she tried to make that easier for them was crucially important in bringing some people who didn't vote for her in 2014 over to her side.
Can I just say one more thing? I see your point about what you were saying about letting the individual districts speak to their populations. But I guess what I'm wondering is, over and over again we hear this notion that about spending and Democrats, which is unfair because often the spending, it's for great reasons and for things that we all want. And I guess what I'm wondering if there's a language change that needs to happen, that often instead of using terms like spending, but more investing, or just the words that are chosen to depict or describe what they're trying to do.
There's been a lot of effort to sort of give the Democratic Party wordsmithing advice over the years, and I'm deeply skeptical of it. The Democratic Party is a collection of constituencies that's organized around the core belief that activist government can make people's lives better in different ways. And trying to find an overarching ideology or just the right buzzword is not going to be their strength. Their strength is mobilizing people and showing that government can make their day-to-day lives better. And it's very different. The two parties are not symmetric. The Republican Party is based on ideological commitment to small government. Values drives them. And the reason our elections are so competitive in part is because, it's often been said, the American public is ideologically conservative in some ways and operationally liberal. People are fearful of big government, but they like their programs. And so the Republicans go out and tell broad stories about, keeping government off the hands of my programs, and Democrats talk about how we can make your lives better. And that has been, even though there's been many, many changes over the decades, that is the enduring struggle of American democracy.
Can I just add that I think the ACA is a good example of this, right? Because it was demonized, people were totally against it, and they saw it work, and now people support it.
Yep.
And here we are at 1:30. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to our panel.